Sonia Soda, Ella Whelan are here. Two stories in town, at least on the front pages. So, Ella, let's start with the virus, shall we? The Daily Mirror, 1 down, 54 million to go. Yes, there is quite a task ahead.
Yes, but as the fact of this vaccine has shown that there have been challenges throughout this pandemic, but the very fact that we have a vaccine now and it's being rolled out means that there can be victories as well. I think the most exciting thing about this is that there's always been a kind of there's tended to be a bit of an underlying fatalism to all of this. There's been a kind of sense of, well, what can we do? The virus is just going to rampage, and we're sort of helpless in the face of it. And of course, thanks to the work of scientists and NHS staff now rolling it out, we have a solution, potentially a solution to coming out of this in the shape of a vaccine. So it's a great day for those of us who want to champion. I mean, the Spiked magazine that I write a column for has a slogan saying humanity is underrated, and I've really got that feeling today. I think most of us actually felt a bit choked when we were listening to the news this morning that this is one hell of a win for humankind. But the question is, will it be the way out out of this abnormal period that we've been living in? And the Metro has a picture of Matt Hancock crying on the front of it, which some people have praised him for. Others, maybe like me, are a bit more cynical about the Quentin Letts in the Times later on in the papers, talking about whether or not that really was a genuine tear or not. There's a sense in which ministers and the government still knows that they have a game to play. They still are batting away the idea that normal is returning. They still very much want to keep up the pressure on people remaining in the restrictions that we have at the moment. The question is, when the vaccine comes, especially when the Oxford vaccine comes and is put through the regulators, will we be able to return to normal? When will that happen? All these questions are really important, because let's not forget, it's miserable living under the current restrictions that we are in for various different reasons. So let's celebrate and keep up the momentum and the optimism of the fact that this should spell a return to not a new normal, but normality.
Yes, and if we move on to the Express, similar sentiment. It certainly has been miserable for many of those older people who were in hospital today, Sonia, to get vaccinated, who have not been to the shops, some of them since March, who have not really seen anybody and used the telephone to communicate. It really has been miserable for them, and I personally felt a bit teary, you know, never mind Matt Hancock. Listening to their stories today, they were remarkable people who found great excitement in the prospect of what their life could now hold.
Absolutely. And I think it is so important to remember the massive difference that this vaccine could eventually make. But the biggest difference will obviously come for the people who made the biggest sacrifices. And those were people who are the highest risk. There was shielding for 3 months earlier this year. Lots of them have felt that they've had to take extra precautions even since then. And, you know, people living in care homes, older people living by themselves who might be quite isolated and lonely, haven't seen their loved ones for a really long time, some people. And so this is the difference that a vaccine and that scientific progress makes. It's a difference between, you know, facing many more months of this and actually an end being in sight for the first time, it feels. So I think it's a hugely exciting day. I think, you know, the most profound impact it will have will be, you know, the people who get vaccinated first, the very highest risk. But I think it's going to have a huge impact on the rest of us as well. And I think it will make things much easier as well for businesses, because I think that now that there's a sort of time-limited window that we're going to need to live under restrictions by, you know, touch wood, so long as vaccine rollout goes well, which hopefully it will, then it means that the Treasury can afford to be more generous with businesses that need support to stay afloat during this crisis, which we're still very much under. So it's really, really positive news all round. Of course, there are still big logistical challenges in rolling it out, in making sure that as many of us as possible get vaccinated. But it's just generally brilliant news. And I'm somebody who's been a huge critic of this government when it comes to implementing, for example, the Test and Trace scheme, PPE, getting PPE to the NHS frontline. But the vaccine does just feel like a great news story that there isn't really an edge to.
Yes, and certainly it's cheaper if this doesn't go on forever, to pick up on your point there. But Ella, do you think that there was a sort of a cautionary note which was really loud today and perhaps the government has learnt the lessons from, opening up day on July the 4th or Eat Out to help out, then actually this solves nothing just yet. 800,000 people will be vaccinated this week, but that is nothing compared to the scale of the issue currently facing the UK. This will go on until the spring. Takes us to the Daily Telegraph, which is talking about masks still being needed for a year, despite the vaccine, which I know you're not so happy about.
Yes, I mean, the fact is this can only be rolled out at the rate that the government can roll it out. And there are certain, you might wish that they had better, were better able to marshal resources, and you can criticise them for it being too slow, or you can celebrate them for actually it being quite fast, whatever. This is going to take time. And so, yes, I think everyone accepts that it's not going to be the end of the week and we'll all be back out having parties in the street. We know that that's not going to happen. But that's a very different question to what's being suggested, particularly by Patrick Vallance and others, saying that parts of our abnormal life in 2020 would be here to stay and would become part of the new normal. So whether it's wearing face masks, whether it's doing social distancing, the question we're faced with now is that, at the moment we're dealing with coronavirus. In a few years, perhaps it would be something different. Maybe there will be other public health issues that people use the excuse of safety first, or use the argument of safety first to combat. So, what other preventative measures will we allow, and will we sacrifice our the normal and risky parts of our life to prevent against? Part of the problem I have is that, life isn't as easy as everything's okay if you remain safe. There are many, many things that we do that are risky, that are unsafe in life, that we think are valuable. If you just take, for example, the issue of the sort of lack of humanity among lots of the discussions around how to deal with coronavirus. I mean, lots of people informally, though they might not admit it, will have, for example, broken the rules to be with loved ones when they were dying, to be there when it was necessary, we take risks and we bend rules and we make, largely sensible decisions all the time. And if we're going to maintain this sort of idea, this safety first approach, whether it's in a kind of shallow format of wearing masks, or actually a more serious thing of social distancing, which means social fabric doesn't return in any way that's recognizable, what effect does that have on us as a society, us as a collective? The thing that I miss most about all of this is not going to the pub, is not, going out partying or going abroad. It's public life. It's the feeling that people aren't flinching from you on the street. And that is the thing that I think we need to regain, because you end up in quite dystopian territory when you start saying that it's normal to be antisocial, which is what social distancing entails.
I mean, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I don't think anyone's saying that that's normal at all. And in fact, I think this Telegraph story sort of, the headline kind of rather overblows a little bit what's in the piece. So Sir Patrick Vallance is saying, because we don't know yet the impact of the existing vaccines on transmission, that's why we may need to wear masks until we know what impact they have. But actually, and I think we're going to move on to this next, there's some pretty good news coming out about the Oxford vaccine, which is the vaccine that we've got the most doses ordered of. It does look like, from the data, that reduces transmission. So nobody's saying that there should be social distancing when we've all been vaccinated and we don't need to social distance. I mean, that would be absolutely ridiculous.
Yes.
Do you mind potential for it to be argued?
Yes, indeed. It has been a debate about how we live and everything. Well, apologies, I'm going to move on if you don't mind, because we do want to get to the news about the Oxford vaccine, peer-reviewed. It's on the double-page spread in The Times. Two interesting points that I have read in this story. One is, obviously, the regulators don't know which regimen to give, whether it's the 2 full doses or the 1.5 doses, which had very different efficacy. And the second thing is the news that the trials for this vaccine tested for asymptomatic infection and whether it stops transmission of the virus, which is one of the great unknowns, isn't it? So very interesting. And the crucial thing about this, obviously, is it's cheaper, and the storage makes it so much easier to use across the world then, Sonia.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the transmission thing is really good news, because if we know that a vaccine prevents asymptomatic transition as well as the symptoms, that means we won't be wearing masks when we've all been vaccinated, unless people, want to do so themselves. So that's really good news. But I think that story about how they figured out that the half dose was more effective than the full dose is actually really interesting. So it was because they had a batch of the vaccine where it was giving two readings about strength, and so they weren't sure which one it was. So they took the more cautious approach and vaccinated at the half dose. It became very obvious quite quickly afterwards that it was the half dose, because people were getting less achy arms and less fevers, etc. And then they decided to carry on with a trial at that half dose, and they got better results for it, which is what the regulator's going to be looking at. So it's a really interesting example of where something happened that perhaps wasn't planned, but ended up being quite fortuitous. And this is the vaccine, as you said, Anna, that we've got the most doses on order of. It's cheap. It's going to be much more cheaper for the global south as well, for poorer countries to buy. They're going to be able to buy it at cost, and it doesn't need to be kept at those really, really low temperatures.
Yes.
So, the regulator is looking at it. It's looking at the data. If this vaccine gets approved, I think it's really, really, really good news for us all.
Indeed so. You mentioned side effects. There is a body of opinion that we need to be more honest about side effects so people don't get concerned. Just very quickly before we go to the break, would you both take the vaccine if it was offered?
100%.
In a heartbeat. I'm sour that I'll probably be far down the list because we're too young and too healthy. And it's right that the old and vulnerable will get it first. But I'll take it the minute I'm offered it.
Oh, there's nothing wrong with being young. I don't include myself in that, by the way. Coming up, crucial talks between the Prime Minister and the President of the European Commission tomorrow. Plenty more on that in just a couple of minutes' time. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now, Sonia Soda and Ella Whelan. Let us look ahead to Wednesday. For the Prime Minister, we now learn, is heading to Brussels on that day. Guardian says the chance of a Brexit deal is very slim. What is the mood music, do you think, Sonia?
So the mood music isn't great. I think people think the chances of the Prime Minister getting a deal have gone down in recent days, just because we've been hearing quite sort of difficult noises from the UK and from the EU side. That said, it's always hard to interpret these things, because both sides always sort of go in quite gung-ho. They always try and lower expectations about what might come out of it. But I do think, all this will he, won't he, I'm not sure anyone in the country is on tenterhooks anymore, because we're also sort of bored of the theatrics of this. But I do think, taking a step back, it's important to remember that we've just, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, which is having a huge impact on the economy. All of the government's own forecasts and independent forecasts from the OBR suggest that whatever type of Brexit we get, even if we get a deal at this stage, the kind of deal that the Prime Minister is going for is so thin and so bare bones that it's going to have a bigger impact on the economy in the medium term than the pandemic. And that's just not a sort of percentage knocked off GDP. That's people's jobs, that's industries, in areas of the country that really can't afford to lose jobs.
But Sonia, I guess it could be added to in the future, couldn't it? Just because there is a deadline in just over 3 weeks' time, which slightly freaks me out because Christmas is in the way and I see your lovely trees and I've got a lot to do. But anyway, we really don't have very long. But surely they can then build on that afterwards, if you know what I mean. And yeah, just very quickly then.
But even if we get a deal, the OBR's forecast is even a Brexit with a deal, which may be able to be added to, I'm sure it can be over the coming years, but it's going to be such a sort of economic kind of grinding shift to us that has an impact that plays out over a number of years, that, they're saying that it's going to have a bigger impact, than the actual pandemic. So I just think that reminds us how huge it is.
I'm moving us along. I do apologise. The Times also last-ditch push for a Brexit deal. Ella, I know you're bursting to say things about that, but if you don't mind, I want to move on to our final story. Sorry, there's no welcome in the hillside. Kate, the brief royal train tour, sort of parts of Wales and Scotland not entirely chuffed about it.
No, but rather critical of the Royals tour, obviously in relation to the fact that it looks like a bit of a jolly at a time when everyone's thinking a bit miserably. But you know, whenever I think about the Royals, it brings me back to Brexit, because I think whether we do get a deal or we don't get a deal at this point, the question of democracy, the big question mark that was set at the face of that issue in 2016 remains. And for me anyway, it doesn't stop at the European Union. It continues on to questions about the House of Lords and indeed the monarchy. So whatever happens, the genie's been let out of the bottle, and this spirit of democracy, this question of rebellion, if you want to put it there, is there. And maybe Kate and Wills might be next in terms of a referendum. Who knows?
You are introducing so many more subjects than we have time for, I have to say. But we will talk next time, no doubt. Ella Whelan and Sonia Soda, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.